The courtroom throbbed with a heavy, anticipatory silence. When Beyoncé entered, wearing a dark, structured blazer and an expression that brooked no performance, the tension shifted, everyone felt it. Reporters paused in mid-sentence, cameras lowered, and even the judge waited for her to sit before letting the gavels fall. The prosecutor rose, her voice calm but firm. "Ms. Nolly's Carter, you're here to testify regarding Mr. Combs. Are you prepared?" Beyoncé nodded, voice steady. "Yes," she replied, "I'm ready to speak my truth." She began with her earliest encounters in the music world. Destiny's Child had been young and hopeful. Invited to industry events, Diddy praised them, offered mentorship, but Beyoncé came to see how quickly praise could become control. Pressure thrummed beneath the glamour dot in 2004 at the Miami Shore Club launch. Everything changed tone. Beyoncé and her bandmates were ushered upstairs. Inside was a frightened teenager in a silk robe, spoken to by a man who wasn't Diddy but looked like he didn't belong. Beyoncé met her eyes. The girl mouthed something wordless, but the fear was clear. Beyoncé asked Diddy, but he brushed it off. She chose that role. That moment shifted how Beyoncé saw him. The next few years, she kept her distance but couldn't just vanish. She felt trapped between loyalty to her career and growing unease. She declined invitations to parties or endorsements, and suddenly her name disappeared from campaigns. Whispers of being cold began to circle. In 2006, during a Grammy weekend party, Beyoncé resisted Diddy's pressure. He called her personally. "Don't make me remind you who gave you your stage." She froze, not for fear of losing the past, but for recognition of manipulation. She attended under protest, posed for the cameras, and stayed 20 feet away. Later, she found strategic emails instructing her publicist to remind her who she is. In 2011, she confronted him. Face to face at a hotel, she told Diddy she refused to be a pawn. His answer cut through the room. "You'll never be bigger than the game." She walked away, ending direct dealings with him and paid the price. Lost campaigns, slashed magazine covers, closed doors. In the Bahamas, at a private artist retreat in 2015, Beyoncé found herself among invited songwriters and musicians in a controlled bubble. Phones had been collected. Late that night, she noticed guards escorting a sobbing young songwriter to her room. Beyoncé felt paralyzed. She knew speaking up could mean disappearing from the industry herself. She left the next morning, chartered a plane, and severed ties with anyone linked to that retreat. Quietly, she began funding legal support anonymously for women who couldn't fight. She confronted her own survival strategy. Protecting her image had meant shielding his machine. She realized fame should never equal immunity for anyone. Her husband, Jay-Z, had warned her. In 2017, after receiving yet another Diddy invite, he urged her not to attend. "You don't owe him anything." Beyoncé took that to heart, declined the invitation, and then faced a backlash of misleading PR about her being too exclusive. She recognized it as retaliation. She spoke of close friendship with Kim Porter, who confided she had witnessed Diddy's destabilizing control over people. Beyoncé teared up as she recounted Kim's whispered plea, "Lock it in a vault, or you'll end up like me." That threat pressed on Beyoncé's conscience, fueling her decision to testify. The turning point was the Met Gala afterparty in 2012. Held at a private residence, Beyoncé watched Diddy entrance, 3 barely legal girls, styled like dolls. One woman collapsed. Diddy laughed and said, "She's feeling the love." Beyoncé didn't intervene. Instead, she walked away. Ashamed, carried that shame until today. Another flashpoint occurred on the Beverly Hills estate. During the Roc Nation brunch in January 2015, a young bartender was led away by Diddy. Beyoncé followed. A locked door held muffled sobs and coercive whispers. "This is the price." She froze, unable to act, and left. That moment transformed her. No longer a bystander, she became an advocate. Beyoncé spoke directly to the jury. She hadn't testified to destroy Diddy. She testified to strip away a facade so no woman would wonder if her silence was safety. She refused the machinery of erasure cultivated by fame. In closing, Beyoncé acknowledged her own complicity. She had stayed silent for fear of losing everything she built. But silence, she realized, was not protection. It was a leash. She sat forward, voice ringing with purpose. She refused to watch another queen be sacrificed so a king could thrive. She asked jurors not to be swayed by her celebrity, but to weigh her facts and truth. Finally, Beyoncé closed her appeal to women. She saw them, she believed them, and she had once silenced them with her silence. But that ended here. "I won't dance anymore with a system that worships power over people." A hush swallowed the room. Beyoncé rose, composed. She didn't glare at the press or offer a soundbite. She simply walked out, leaving behind the echo of shattered silence and a reckoning long overdue. As Beyoncé exited that courtroom, the air didn't return to normal. It stayed thick with the weight of what had just transpired. The courtroom was still, every corner of it carrying echoes of her words. No one looked at her as a pop icon anymore. she had transformed into something else, something more dangerous, to systems built on silence, a witness armed with truth. The judge's gavel remained untouched. It wasn't needed. Order had been established, not by authority, but by the unmistakable clarity of what Beyoncé had delivered. Outside, the press held back not in fear, but in awe. No one wanted to break the moment. Cameras flashed quietly, more like respectful observers than intruders. On social media, her words spread like wildfire, not in sensational headlines, but in quotes that resonated across timelines and borders. People weren't reacting, they were reflecting. This wasn't just celebrity testimony. It was an unraveling of decades of cultural gaslighting. Inside the courtroom, murmurs resumed. Jurors exchanged glances that spoke volumes. They were no longer debating a verdict on one man. They were now carrying the burden of what justice meant for a generation who'd only seen consequences for the voiceless. The prosecution team reset their files, their hands slightly trembling not from nerves, but from the realization that they were handling not just legal documents, but fragments of an industry's darkest truths. In the days that followed, more stories surfaced. Stylists, background dancers, personal assistants, former friends. None of them had Beyoncé's platform, but her testimony had given them something far more valuable: permission to speak. The quiet parts of the entertainment world, the ones who cleaned up after the parties, managed last-minute bookings, scrubbed rumors from headlines, they began to speak up. Beyoncé had cracked the silence. And now, the ripple was turning into a wave. Record labels began issuing statements. Public relations firms initiated internal reviews. Non-disclosure agreements were being quietly torn up behind closed doors as executives scrambled to assess how deep the rot really went. Suddenly, being close to Diddy wasn't a mark of prestige, it was a warning sign. Jay-Z, though not in the courtroom, issued a brief but powerful statement: "I stand by the truth, and by the woman who had the courage to speak it." No branding, no flourishes, just solidarity. In a world where image is currency, his silence would have said enough. But his voice lent credibility and support to Beyoncé's leap into transparency. Industry leaders began to fear subpoenas more than bad press. Whisper networks became visible. Threads, and journalists who once hesitated to touch these stories now had names, dates, and corroborations. The very machinery that once hid predators began to turn on itself. Boards were questioned. Awards were rescinded. And for once, victims were named, not in scandal, but in support. Young women across the country watched her testimony. Some saw their own pasts mirrored in her descriptions: the missed red flags, the casual manipulation masked as mentorship, the cost of saying no. Survivors of other industries wrote essays and held panels, drawing parallels to what Beyoncé had exposed. Her words had translated across professions, across fame, across race. The silence wasn't just about Diddy anymore. It was about every man who had benefited from invisibility. Meanwhile, Diddy's defense team floundered. The usual strategies: discredit the witness, blame the media, lean on old alliances had been neutralized. Beyoncé hadn't shown up to point fingers. She had shown up to confess her own silence. That vulnerability made her untouchable. You can't discredit someone who admits their flaws before you even try. In private, women who had once shared rooms with Diddy, studios with Quincy, stages with others now whispered, "If she can speak, so can I." That was the shift. Beyoncé didn't just unlock the courtroom. She unlocked a collective reckoning that even the best crisis teams couldn't spin away. Behind the scenes, lawsuits multiplied. Former staff from Diddy's events quietly reached out to legal teams. Depositions were scheduled. Statutes of limitations were re-examined. The entertainment world wasn't ending, but it was being rewritten in real time. Beyoncé herself remained quiet after that day. No interviews, no exclusive features. Just a silence that spoke louder than any PR campaign. The absence of a media tour wasn't an oversight, it was the message. She had said what she came to say, and now she let the truth do the rest. Within the court, the atmosphere didn't reset. Every witness after her walked into a space already reshaped by her truth. The courtroom had become less of a trial venue and more of a confessional, where every performance was measured not by charisma but by candor. And somewhere, far from the cameras and headlines, a young woman who once stood frozen in a corridor, whether to speak, unsure whether she'd be believed, was now watching Beyoncé's testimony on a cracked phone screen. And for the first time in years, she felt seen. Let me know if you'd like more of this continuation or if you want this compiled into a full-length document. The weeks following Beyoncé's testimony turned into a cascading storm of consequences. Inside boardrooms, decisions, once based on profit and public favor, were being revisited. Executives who once protected abusers through strategic silence found themselves fielding calls not from agents but from attorneys. Internal memos leaked, NDAs surfaced, and brands began detaching themselves from names that had once been untouchable. It wasn't just Diddy on trial anymore. It was a system. At universities and film schools, Her testimony became assigned reading. Professors broke down not just what she said, but how she said it calmly, factually, without spectacle. She had converted lived pain into structured truth. Her words were now dissected alongside historic civil testimonies, not because she was a star, but because she had crossed the line between culture and courage. At home, Beyoncé's daughters grew up overnight. They watched as their mother became more than just a performer. They saw her become a voice for the voiceless. She sat with them one evening, showing them how strength is not about perfection, but about showing up when it's hardest. We speak, she told them, even when it's scary. Especially then. Jay-Z, for his part, stood beside her, not as a husband alone, but as someone who now had to re-examine his own silences. Behind closed doors, they rewrote their household values not about image, but about integrity. Their home was no longer a fortress for success, but a workshop for truth. In cities across America, community centers, activist groups, and support networks saw a spike in women reaching out. Beyoncé's testimony had opened a floodgate. She hadn't pointed a spotlight at herself, she had built a path forward. More women began filing complaints, starting legal proceedings they'd once thought impossible. Suddenly, the phrase "if Beyoncé can, so can I" became more than motivation, it became movement. Media outlets that had once hesitated to print allegations against the powerful now took a different stance. Editors published op-eds apologizing for their past silences. Headlines that used to glorify lavish parties now told the real stories behind the velvet ropes. There were no more euphemisms. Diddy's name, once synonymous with success, now stood beside terms like coercion, complicity, and collapse. But not everyone cheered. Behind anonymous accounts, beneath carefully worded statements, resistance simmered. Other powerful men, watching from the shadows, began reinforcing their walls. They canceled events, reviewed old footage, and tightened their circles. They feared what Beyoncé had started, not because she'd accused them, but because she dared to tell the truth in full light. Her decision reverberated internationally. In London, Paris, Johannesburg, women in entertainment began demanding their own inquiries. Some studios opened anonymous tip lines. Others conducted closed-door audits of long-buried complaints. The world was finally seeing that silence wasn't just a symptom, it was a strategy. On court, testimonies grew bolder. Victims who had prepared short, cautious statements began rewriting them. They wanted to match her clarity. They wanted to be remembered not as footnotes, but as chapters in the same revolution. Beyoncé had cracked the courtroom ceiling not with fame, but with responsibility. Meanwhile, at the grave of Kim Porter, flowers began to appear from strangers. Cards written in trembling hands said, "We heard you," even in silence. Beyoncé made sure one of those bouquets was hers. She didn't sign it. She didn't need to. The flowers were her answer to Kim's final letter. Yes, I used the power. Yes, the truth is out now. The entertainment world that once thrived on exclusivity was now facing inclusion in the most uncomfortable way. No one could excuse ignorance anymore. Those who remained silent faced their own reflection in public discourse. The line between bystander and accomplice was becoming harder to ignore. As for Beyoncé, she returned home not triumphant, but changed. She spent her days quieter, not hiding, but healing. She read letters from survivors, most she never met. She listened more than she spoke. Her silence now held a different power, one that came from peace, not fear. Let me know if you'd like me to continue the narrative or organize this into a document. Here is the final segment of the rewritten narrative. Closing the story with weight and resolution. The world didn't shift overnight, but it shifted enough. Diddy's trial continued, but the verdict had already been delivered in the hearts of millions who had listened to the truth. Beyoncé dared to speak. It wasn't about whether he'd walk free or be imprisoned. It was about the end of an era where fame could shield predators and silence survivors. His empire, once built on glitz, now teetered under the weight of exposed rot. Beyoncé didn't return to the stage immediately. She didn't need to. Her performance had already happened, not with music, but with conviction. In the months that followed, she funded a national initiative for whistleblower protections in the entertainment industry. Not just for women, but for anyone too afraid to speak. She gave her silence a name, and then she gave it purpose. When asked in a quiet interview if she'd ever perform again, she smiled and said, "Every time someone tells their story, that's the show now." She knew she didn't need a spotlight to be heard anymore. She had handed the mic to a generation and told them, "Your voice matters, and it's enough." At award shows that once worshipped power over principle, things began to change. Not just in who was celebrated, but in what was tolerated. A new kind of royalty emerged, not crowned by charts, but by courage. And in every acceptance speech that honored truth, Beyoncé's echo could be heard low, steady, and permanent. The legacy of her testimony wasn't fame, it was foundation, a framework of accountability that would be built upon by women and men alike, until the idea of silence as safety was nothing more than a ghost of a darker past. She had turned confession into resistance. and fear into clarity. And in the final pages of her journey through that courtroom, Beyoncé wasn't remembered for the records she broke, but for the silence she shattered. She walked out, not with applause, but with an entire culture holding its breath, knowing that once a queen dares to speak, the kingdom can never again pretend it didn't hear. If you'd like this compiled into a formatted document or script, I can prepare it for you.